Hey guys, I hope you're doing good today. I want to pop on here and talk about real quick, what does it mean to be successful? So I just watched a documentary on Amazon called The Men That Built America. It was super intriguing and I strongly suggest you checking it out. It talked about Vanderholt, Andrew Carnegie, JP Morgan, and of course Rockefeller. So if I've said those names and you've known anything about American history, you've traveled to New York, you've heard those names and you're like, oh my gosh, Carnegie Hall, Rockefeller Center, like, yes, JP Morgan banks, like, yes, like, oh my gosh, like, these guys were influential, crazy successful, like, more money than you can even imagine. So as you watch these stories, it blows my mind the opportunities and the risks that they take, how they came from nothing, how they built their companies from nothing, and were essentially more powerful than the President of the United States. You have to remember, America was still very new in its time. There wasn't regulations. There wasn't, workers' comp and minimum wages set. And as I'm watching these stories and seeing about, especially the last three gentlemen, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan, and seeing the choices that they made, I'm super inspired and I'm super challenged, but then also I'm stricken in my heart. So just so you know, those three gentlemen are the reason why we have gasoline, steel, and electricity. So Carnegie was the man that kind of revolutionized the concept of steel. That's what makes all of our buildings. That's why we have skyscrapers. That's why we can have huge, massive bridges that can hold tons and tons of weight. He was the first one to build a bridge over the Mississippi, and he ultimately found a way to create steel that was more cost effective, that was quicker, and built an empire off of that. Then Rockefeller was the one who first started with kerosene. This is when people, of course, did not have electricity, so they used this to light their homes. And he ultimately kind of moved it towards gasoline in a very wise way, and just was a genius in his own right for it. JP Morgan was a man that was more than he was an inventor. He was really good at investing. He was good at finding companies and merging them together. And he so happened to come across this little old guy named Thomas Edison. Maybe you know who he is. So I'm looking at Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan, and I'm like, wow, like, I can't, when they tell you how much money they made or their companies still make, it's just, it blows your mind. I'm like, what does it take to be one of these kinds of people? Like, that level of genius, they operated on a whole nother playing field than the rest of us. And as I'm inspired and I'm looking at their life, there were also things within the story, like I said, that struck my heart. And Rockefeller was known to be more of a man of faith. He did not drink, did not cuss. He was supposed to be more wholesome, but yet whenever he got that thirst, that hunger, that lust for success, he would cut his workers' wages. He would increase their hours. There are men that were literally working 12, 14 hours a day, 6, 7 days a week. And he kept pushing it, because that was ultimately their biggest cost, was labor. And this was a practice that all the men did. And they stopped looking at people as people and ultimately just played the game. It no longer was about money, because they had more money than they could even deal with. It just became about being the best. And after they had so much money and they didn't really need to get any more, then they started competing on how much money they could give away. They wanted to look like a philanthropist. They wanted to look like somebody that really cared about society. I think Carnegie was the one that disappointed me the most, because when I've ever heard of Carnegie Hall, wow, if you're a musician or a musical person, you're like, wow, Carnegie Hall, like, that is the place that would be so cool to go and be there and sing and perform or whatever. But he was a man that was very torn. In the story, oh my goodness, if you watch it, they built a club house that was up on a mountain. And in order for them to get up, they would always have to lower the dam. But every time they would lower the dam, it would weaken the wall. Well, down in the valley was a little town called Johnstown. You have to look it up, because it was actually the largest man-made massacre in the U.S. before 9/11 came. 2,000 people died because these guys just wanted to go up in the mountain and have their fancy home and ride their boats in the lake, and they did not listen to the town's warnings, and they kept lowering the dam, ultimately breaking it and flattening 4 miles of homes, ultimately killing 2,000 people like crazy. And so because he felt bad for being involved in that, of course he gave to the Red Cross and things like that. But a lot of his practices, he would leave the country and put other people in charge to do things that were unethical. That he would work his steel workers, because Carnegie was the man that invented steel, as we know it today, the enterprise of steel. He would literally work his workers so poorly. 1 in 11 steel workers would die every year and suffer severe burns and damage because they were pressed. And when you're working 12 hours a day, like, you can't function, especially when you're working with fire and heavy steel. And he would literally just leave the country so that way he wouldn't be the one to blame, because he was always trying to look good in the public's eye, but not actually genuinely care about his workers. JP Morgan, he jumped on the idea of making electricity so popular. He created General Electric. You probably know what it is. And of course he got with Thomas Edison, but it was always a competition because Tesla used AC and there's DC, the different types of current for electricity, and they were trying to always prove something. And so ultimately, and this is what's so crazy to me, I've always looked up to Thomas Edison as somebody that was just like, wow, revolutionary, genius. And during this time where he was in some competitive streak, he actually invented the electrical chair. So you think about this, you're like, okay, this guy, he invented the light bulb. What is success? But as he was trying to prove something, as he was just trying to be the big dog, he worked for the government and invented the electrical chair. Now, I don't care what you think about the death penalty. It doesn't matter if you're for or against it. I don't think anybody wants to be known as the person that invented the electrical chair. But we don't ever give Thomas Edison that credit, do we? But he did. That was one of his things. And slowly, as I'm watching this series, I'm being inspired, of course, like I said, but then I'm also realizing where we measure our success. And I wanted to bring this up to you guys because maybe you're like me, you're somebody that's inspired to do something really great with your life. You're wanting to be a success in your own way, in your own right. But sometimes we forget what that measure is. And all that success is reaching a goal or aim. Like, literally, that's the definition, is to reach a desired goal. So you have to ask yourself, what do I desire to do with my life? And I looked at these 3 men, and yeah, it would be nice to have their influence and their contributions to society, but do I want to be the person that was literally the reason for the depression? Like, their choices and their cutbacks literally made it impossible for people to live, and they were partly to blame, mostly to blame for the depression. And there were other things that they contributed, of course, that were positive. And I do always preach about giving people mercy, and nobody's going to be perfect, but there is a fine line where you get driven by this lust for power and success, that you are worldly success, that you forget the human side of everything. And so I would just encourage you to know that you are successful right now where you're at, because you're trying, you're taking every day and you're trying to do something that's going to make your world and somebody else's world better. And I always remember the scripture Mark 8:36 that says, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? I don't want to be somebody that is always striving for the next thing, that gets caught in this snare that thinks that what I have is not good enough, or what I do have won't satisfy me. And I think these gentlemen were unfortunately stuck in a prison within their own mind, within their own hearts, because they forgot what life was most about. And if you believe in an afterlife, if you believe that there's meaning to life outside of this life, after this life, then you have to remember that it's not about how much money you have in the bank. It's not about the number of people that know your name. It's about the impact that you left on every person you came in contact with. They had a few scenes where it showed the funerals of these gentlemen, and not many people showed up. Now, it might just have been a depiction, or, they were trying to play into the story, but I truly believe that if we're going to live a life of success in our hearts and our minds, we have to define what that success is. We have to say, okay, yeah, I would love to have more money in the bank. Yeah, I would like to be healthier. Yeah, I would like to, build up my portfolio, whatever your desires are. But can I say that I am successful right now in the people that I have contact with every single day, and to my family, to my friends? And there's so many more things that I could say, obviously, about this, but I just really felt inspired to remind everybody that success is something that you determine for your life, not anybody else, not the government, not world records, because there are going to be people that to this day will die without ever driving a car, without ever having electricity in their home, without ever even walking in a building built with steel. And even though those three gentlemen, Rockefeller, Carnegie, or Morgan, did those things and did contribute to society, there'll be people that will never know their names and never be affected by their choices, but they will be affected by one universal thing, and that is to be loved and to be appreciated and to be valued in this life. That is what success is. So keep on keeping on, guys. Know that you have value and you contribute something to this world. And if you keep doing things that are for others, you will be a success. God bless.